1943, and Bernard Montgomery is sitting in his command tent, composing what he believes is a reasonable request to remove George S. Patton from command after the slapping incidents in Sicily, absolutely certain that Winston Churchill will agree, because surely civilized warfare requires civilized generals. And he's about to discover that Churchill's definition of civilized has nothing to do with manners and everything to do with winning. What follows isn't a polite diplomatic exchange. It's a masterclass in brutal pragmatism, where Britain's wartime leader makes it crystal clear that the Allied High Command isn't a gentleman's club where reputations matter more than results. And if you think you know how Churchill handled difficult personalities, you're about to learn that when it came to generals who win battles versus generals who complain about them, Churchill's choice was simpler and harsher than anyone expected. Stay with me, because this story reveals the razor-thin line between military discipline and military effectiveness, and why the most explosive general in the Allied army survived controversies that should have ended his career because one man understood that wars aren't won by saints. Montgomery in 1943 is riding high on his North Africa success. Alamein made him a household name. He's Britain's most famous general, and he genuinely believes his reputation gives him influence over Allied command decisions, including who gets to keep their stars and who gets sent home in disgrace. Patton, meanwhile, has just committed what should be career-ending offenses. He slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in field hospitals, called them cowards, threatened them with execution. And when the story leaked to the press, it created exactly the kind of scandal that ends military careers. Because you can't have generals physically assaulting enlisted men, regardless of circumstances. Montgomery sees opportunity here. He's never liked Patton, finds him crude and undisciplined and too aggressive, thinks American generals lack the professional refinement of British officers, and he genuinely believes that removing Patton will improve Allied command dynamics. So he drafts his suggestion, expecting Churchill to recognize the wisdom of replacing a controversial general with someone more manageable. Here's what Montgomery doesn't understand about Churchill. The Prime Minister isn't interested in manageable generals. He's interested in generals who win. And Patton, for all his flaws and controversies and explosive personality, has one quality that matters more than any scandal. He takes ground faster than anyone else in the Allied army. His Third Army moves with speed that terrifies German commanders. His aggressive tactics create opportunities that methodical commanders miss. And Churchill understands that winning the war requires tolerating personalities that peacetime militaries would never accept. Think about Churchill's own career. He's made catastrophic mistakes like Gallipoli. He's been fired and rehired. He's survived controversies that would sink lesser politicians. He understands that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary people, and extraordinary people are rarely comfortable or easy to manage. So when Montgomery's suggestion reaches him, Churchill's response isn't diplomatic consideration. It's immediate, brutal rejection, delivered with the kind of clarity that ends debates permanently. The exact words of Churchill's response vary, depending on which memoir you trust, but the substance is consistent and devastating. Montgomery gets told in unmistakable terms that war isn't a place for wounded pride, that results matter more than reputations, that Patton's value to the Allied cause exceeds the scandal of slapping soldiers, and that if Montgomery wants to concern himself with command decisions, perhaps he should focus on moving faster instead of complaining about colleagues who are already moving. This isn't a polite diplomatic brush-off. This is Churchill at his most pragmatic and ruthless, willing to subordinate military protocol to military effectiveness, and the implicit message to Montgomery is clear. You're valuable, but you're not irreplaceable, and you definitely don't get to determine who else is irreplaceable. The hierarchy of Allied command gets clarified in this moment, not through formal channels or official documents, but through one conversation where Britain's leader makes it obvious that winning matters more than anything else, including the ego of his most famous general. Montgomery's reaction to this rejection reveals everything about his character. He doesn't push back, doesn't argue, doesn't threaten to resign, because he understands that Churchill isn't bluffing, and that British command culture still operates on the principle that political leaders make final decisions and generals execute them. But privately, he's furious. He believes Churchill is prioritizing American relations over British military judgment. He thinks Patton is getting special treatment because Eisenhower protects him, and Churchill won't contradict Eisenhower, and he's partially right about the politics but completely wrong about the motivation, because Churchill's defense of Patton isn't about politics. It's about cold calculation that the fastest, most aggressive Allied general is worth more to victory than any scandal he creates. If you think this damaged Montgomery's relationship with Churchill, you're absolutely right. But if you think it changed how either man approached the war, you're wrong. Montgomery continues commanding with his methodical, careful style, and Churchill continues tolerating him while wishing he'd move faster. And Patton continues being Patton. Slapping soldiers was inexcusable, but he doesn't get fired because Churchill decided results trump protocol. Let's examine the broader context of Allied command dynamics in 1943. Because Montgomery's suggestion doesn't happen in isolation, it happens during a period when British and American command relationships are strained by competing egos, competing strategies, and competing national interests that all have to somehow coexist within a unified command structure that's unified mostly in theory. The Americans are contributing more troops and more equipment as 1943 progresses, which means American generals are gaining influence while British generals are losing it, and Montgomery represents the old guard of British imperial military tradition where breeding and education and proper conduct matter enormously, while Patton represents American meritocracy where results are everything and background means nothing, and if you can fight, nobody cares if you're crude. These aren't just personality conflicts, they're cultural conflicts between different military traditions, forced to cooperate by strategic necessity, and Churchill understands this tension intimately because he's managing the larger political relationship with Roosevelt, where Britain is increasingly the junior partner, and that reality influences every command decision. Patton's slapping incidents deserve examination, because Montgomery isn't wrong to find them inexcusable. You can't have generals physically assaulting soldiers suffering from psychiatric trauma. It violates every principle of military discipline and human decency. But Churchill's pragmatic calculation is that removing Patton creates bigger problems than keeping him, because German commanders fear Patton specifically. They respect Montgomery, they're wary of Bradley, but they fear Patton because his tactics are unpredictable, and his speed is unmatched, and fear is a strategic asset you don't discard lightly. The German High Command after Sicily is trying to predict where the next Allied invasion will hit, and one of their major concerns is where Patton will command, because wherever he goes, the front will move faster than their defensive preparations can handle. So keeping Patton in command isn't just about one general's effectiveness, it's about maintaining psychological pressure on German strategic planning. And Churchill grasps this while Montgomery doesn't, because Montgomery thinks tactically, while Churchill thinks strategically. The irony of Montgomery suggesting Patton's removal is that Montgomery himself is controversial among American commanders. Eisenhower finds him difficult and overly cautious. Bradley thinks he's more concerned with personal glory than Allied victory. Patton openly despises him. And if Churchill applied Montgomery's logic consistently, he'd remove Montgomery for being a source of Allied command friction. But Churchill doesn't, because Montgomery delivers victories, even if he delivers them slower than Churchill would prefer. And that same logic protects Patton. Both generals are flawed. Both create command difficulties. Both survive because they win battles. And Churchill's genius is recognizing that perfection in generals is impossible, so you tolerate flaws as long as victories keep coming. Remember when Montgomery was confident his suggestion would be accepted? That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Churchill to respond with brutal clarity that winning wars requires tolerating winners regardless of their flaws. The political dimension of Churchill's decision matters, because by 1943, Britain is dependent on American military production and American troop contributions, which means Churchill can't afford to alienate American military leadership by removing their most famous aggressive general at the request of Britain's most famous methodical general. Roosevelt might interpret that as British attempt to control American command decisions, and that interpretation could damage the entire Allied relationship that Churchill has spent years carefully constructing. So Churchill's defense of Patton isn't just about Patton's military value. It's about maintaining political equilibrium within the alliance, about signaling to Americans that Britain respects their command autonomy, about preventing the kind of command crisis that could fracture Allied unity, and Montgomery either doesn't understand these political calculations or doesn't care because he's focused on his narrow interpretation of proper military conduct. This is the difference between theater commanders and national leaders. Theater commanders think about their immediate operational environment. National leaders think about how operational decisions impact strategic relationships, and Churchill lives in that strategic space where every decision has implications beyond the immediate military question. Patton's survival after the slapping incidents and Churchill's protection of him create a precedent that influences Allied command culture for the rest of the war. It establishes that battlefield effectiveness can outweigh personal conduct issues, that aggressive commanders get more latitude than cautious ones, that political leaders will intervene to protect generals they consider essential regardless of what other generals think, and most importantly, that the coalition warfare requires accepting Allies' command decisions even when you disagree with them. Montgomery learns this lesson permanently. He never again tries to get American generals removed. He complains about them constantly in private, but he stops trying to use official channels to influence American command decisions because Churchill made it clear that path leads nowhere. If you think this makes Montgomery more cooperative, you'd be mistaken. He just becomes more subtle about pursuing his agenda, more careful about working around American commanders rather than trying to remove them, more focused on positioning himself for post-war British military leadership where American opinions won't matter. The human element of this story is Churchill understanding something about warfare that Montgomery doesn't, that soldiers don't fight for perfect commanders. They fight for commanders who lead them to victory, and Patton's soldiers, despite his flaws and temper and occasional cruelty, follow him with devotion because he wins and winning keeps them alive, and getting home alive matters more than whether their commander has proper manners. Montgomery's soldiers respect him and trust his methodical approach, but they don't love him the way Patton's soldiers love Patton. And Churchill recognizes this emotional dimension of military leadership that can't be taught or faked. You either have the ability to inspire soldiers to follow you into hell or you don't. And Patton has it despite everything wrong with his personality, while Montgomery doesn't, despite everything right with his tactical competence. Wars require both types of commanders, methodical professionals and aggressive warriors. And Churchill's wisdom is recognizing you need both and tolerating both and protecting both, even when they hate each other, because victory requires diverse approaches to diverse problems. The aftermath of Churchill's rejection of Montgomery's suggestion plays out over the remaining years of the war in subtle ways. Montgomery becomes more isolated within Allied command. His relationship with American generals never recovers from his attempts to influence their command decisions. Eisenhower increasingly sidelines him in favor of commanders who cooperate rather than criticize. And by the time Market Garden fails in 1944, Montgomery has burned through most of his political capital, while Patton is racing across France, proving Churchill's judgment correct. This doesn't mean Montgomery was wrong about Patton's conduct. Slapping soldiers was inexcusable, and Patton should have faced consequences. But it means Churchill was right about the larger strategic calculation that removing effective commanders during a total war creates bigger problems than tolerating their flaws. Think about the counterfactual. What happens if Churchill agrees with Montgomery and Patton gets sent home in 1943? The Sicily campaign probably still succeeds. The Italian campaign proceeds roughly the same. But D-Day and the breakout from Normandy and the race across France all happen differently without Patton's Third Army. And maybe the war ends at the same time, or maybe it doesn't. But Germany definitely doesn't face the psychological pressure of Patton's rapid advances. And that psychological pressure matters strategically, even if we can't quantify it precisely. Churchill's broader philosophy of command, revealed in this incident, influences how he handles other difficult generals throughout the war. He protects Montgomery from American complaints about Market Garden. He defends controversial decisions by commanders who deliver results. He intervenes when he thinks political considerations require overruling military judgment, and he consistently prioritizes winning over protocol, which is exactly what you want from wartime leadership, but exactly what peacetime institutions find uncomfortable. This pragmatism comes from Churchill's understanding that World War II is an existential struggle, where defeat means the end of British independence and probably Western civilization as he understands it, so normal peacetime constraints on acceptable conduct and proper procedure get subordinated to the overwhelming priority of victory. And if that requires tolerating generals who slap soldiers, or generals who prioritize personal glory, or generals who hate each other, then Churchill tolerates all of it, because the alternative is losing, and losing is unacceptable. The legacy of Churchill's decision echoes through military command philosophy for decades after the war, because it crystallizes a fundamental tension in military organizations between maintaining discipline and tolerating effective leaders who violate discipline, between enforcing standards equally and recognizing that exceptional people require exceptional tolerance, between rules that apply to everyone and exceptions that apply to winners. Modern militaries still struggle with this tension. They court-martial generals for conduct violations while simultaneously promoting aggressive risk-taking commanders. They enforce zero-tolerance policies while making exceptions for operationally critical personnel. They claim everyone follows the same rules, while obviously some people get more latitude than others. And all of this traces back to decisions like Churchill's, where pragmatic calculations about winning override principled positions about proper conduct. You can argue this is moral compromise, or you can argue this is realistic recognition that perfection is impossible, and wars require imperfect people doing imperfect things in pursuit of necessary victory, and Churchill clearly believed the latter. Montgomery's failure to get Patton removed teaches him about power dynamics within the Allied coalition, but it doesn't change his fundamental personality. He remains convinced throughout his life that he was right about Patton, that Churchill made a political decision rather than a military one, that proper conduct matters more than Montgomery's critics acknowledged. And in some sense he's correct, because tolerating Patton's behavior did send messages about acceptable conduct that undermined military discipline. But he's wrong about the larger calculation, because Churchill wasn't choosing between discipline and effectiveness. He was choosing between losing a controversial general and losing momentum in a war that Britain couldn't afford to prolong. The existential nature of World War II for Britain gets lost sometimes in historical analysis that treats it like a normal war with normal considerations. But for Churchill, every decision happens under the shadow of potential national extinction, which means risks that seem excessive in peacetime become reasonable in existential war, and protecting Patton despite his flaws is exactly the kind of risk Churchill determines is worth taking. The relationship between Churchill and Patton after this incident is interesting, because they don't have much direct contact. Churchill isn't Patton's commander and doesn't need to manage him personally, but Churchill follows Patton's campaigns closely and sees his vindication in every rapid advance and successful operation, while Patton probably never knows the full extent of Churchill's protection, or doesn't care, because Patton's focus is always forward on the next objective, not backward on political maneuvering. This is another difference between Patton and Montgomery. Patton barely thinks about command politics, except when they interfere with his operations, while Montgomery constantly calculates his position and reputation and relationships. And ironically, this means Patton benefits from Churchill's protection without working for it, while Montgomery loses Churchill's full confidence despite trying to maintain it. Success in military politics, like success in regular politics, often goes to people who don't appear to be playing the game. And Patton's apparent indifference to anything except fighting is paradoxically his greatest political asset, because it makes him seem authentic and focused, while Montgomery's obvious concern with reputation makes him seem calculating and self-interested. So here's the truth about Churchill's brutal response when Montgomery wanted to fire Patton. It wasn't about protecting Patton personally or disliking Montgomery personally or any personal consideration at all. It was cold, strategic calculation that wars are won by commanders who take ground, not by commanders who follow proper protocol, that controversial effective generals are worth more than uncontroversial ineffective ones, that Allied unity requires respecting partners' command autonomy even when you disagree with their decisions, and that existential wars require tolerating imperfect people because perfect people don't exist, and waiting for them means losing. Montgomery expected diplomatic consideration of his suggestion, and instead received a lesson in wartime pragmatism that clarified his position within Allied command more brutally than any formal reorganization could have. Churchill wasn't interested in managing egos or mediating disputes or finding comfortable compromises. He was interested in winning as fast as possible with minimum British casualties, and anything that served that goal got supported, while anything that didn't got rejected, regardless of who proposed it. Patton survived, not because Churchill liked him, but because Churchill needed him, and that calculation revealed more about Churchill's leadership philosophy than any of his famous speeches. When survival is at stake, you tolerate winners and worry about their character after victory is secured. If understanding how wartime leadership actually works interests you beyond the sanitized versions in official histories, subscribe, because we're exploring the decisions leaders made under existential pressure, the calculations that determined who led and who followed, and who got protected and who got sacrificed, and the uncomfortable truths about how wars really get won by imperfect people making imperfect decisions that look obvious in retrospect, but required brutal clarity in the moment. And tell me in comments which other command controversies from World War II you want examined with this level of honest analysis, because military history is full of moments where the official story obscures the actual human dynamics that determined outcomes, and those human stories are what really explain why some nations won and others lost. The message Montgomery receives from Churchill in 1943 doesn't end the story. It transforms it, because now you have three of the most powerful personalities in the Allied command structure locked into roles they didn't choose. Churchill protecting a general he finds personally distasteful because strategy demands it. Montgomery nursing resentment while pretending cooperation, and Patton completely unaware he's at the center of a command crisis that could have ended his career, except one man decided winning mattered more than propriety. What happens next isn't reconciliation or resolution. It's 18 months of escalating tension, where every operational decision becomes infected with personal animosity, where strategic disagreements mask ego conflicts, and where the Allied advance toward Germany succeeds, despite rather than because of the command relationships Churchill's decision preserved. Stay with me, because this is where theory meets reality, where Churchill's pragmatic calculation that Patton's value exceeds his flaws gets tested in every campaign from Sicily to the German border, and where we discover whether brutal honesty about command priorities actually wins wars or just postpones the moment when personality conflicts destroy operational effectiveness. Sicily in summer 1943 becomes the first testing ground for whether Churchill's judgment about Patton is correct, and initially it looks like spectacular vindication, because Patton's 7th Army races across the island with exactly the kind of aggressive speed Churchill believes justifies tolerating his conduct issues. Except the race across Sicily isn't really about defeating Germans. It's about Patton competing with Montgomery for glory, trying to reach Messina first, not because Messina matters strategically, but because getting there before Montgomery proves something about American versus British military effectiveness. Montgomery recognizes immediately what's happening, and he's furious because in his calculation, Patton is risking soldiers' lives for personal prestige, taking unnecessary casualties to win a race that doesn't contribute to the actual objective of destroying German forces. And technically, Montgomery is right. The Germans escape across the Strait of Messina because both Allied armies are focused on reaching cities instead of cutting off retreat routes. But Churchill doesn't care about technical correctness. He cares that Patton's speed creates psychological pressure on German commanders and demonstrates American combat effectiveness to Stalin, who's constantly demanding proof that Western allies are seriously fighting. And those political strategic considerations outweigh Montgomery's tactical complaints about proper priorities. The slapping incidents happen during the Sicily campaign, and the timing matters because Patton is riding high on success when he walks into those field hospitals and assaults soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion, which means the incidents occur when Patton believes he's untouchable, when he thinks his victories give him latitude to enforce discipline however he sees fit, and he's shocked when the press gets hold of the story because Patton genuinely doesn't understand why slapping cowards is controversial. In his mental framework, soldiers who break down under stress are failing their duty, and failure deserves punishment, not sympathy. This worldview is common among Patton's generation of officers. They came of age in an era when psychiatric trauma wasn't recognized as legitimate medical condition, when masculine honor culture demanded stoic endurance of suffering, when admitting fear or exhaustion was considered moral failure rather than human limitation. But by 1943, military psychiatry has advanced enough that enlightened commanders recognize combat fatigue as inevitable consequence of sustained fighting. And Patton's refusal to accept this medical reality marks him as dangerously behind modern understanding of human psychology under stress. Yet Churchill protects him anyway, because Churchill's calculation isn't about whether Patton understands psychiatry, it's about whether Patton wins battles. Eisenhower's handling of the Patton slapping crisis reveals the complexity of Allied command, because Eisenhower is Patton's friend and protector, but also Patton's superior, who's responsible for discipline. So Eisenhower tries to split the difference. He reprimands Patton privately, requires him to apologize publicly to the soldiers and units involved, but doesn't remove him from command or court-martial him, which is what regulations technically require, and this compromise satisfies nobody. The soldiers and journalists think Patton got away with assault. Montgomery and other critics think American command protects its own, regardless of conduct, and Patton thinks he's being punished for enforcing necessary discipline. Churchill's support for keeping Patton in command gives Eisenhower political cover for this compromise, because if Britain's Prime Minister publicly states that Patton's military value justifies retaining him despite misconduct, then Eisenhower can tell American critics that Allied unity requires tolerating controversial commanders, and this is coalition warfare in practice. Neither nation gets to make unilateral decisions about senior commanders without considering how the other nation will interpret those decisions and whether the interpretation damages the alliance relationship. The period between Sicily and D-Day, when Patton is effectively sidelined, shows the limits of Churchill's protection, because political reality forces keeping Patton out of visible command, even though military logic says he should be leading armies. So Patton spends months commanding phantom armies in southeast England as part of the deception operation to convince Germans the invasion will hit Pas-de-Calais. And this is psychologically devastating for Patton, who measures his worth entirely by combat command, who believes he's the best tactical general the Allies have, and watching D-Day happen without him confirms his worst fears that political considerations have destroyed his career. Montgomery during this period is commanding all Allied ground forces for the initial invasion, which from Patton's perspective is ultimate injustice. The cautious British general who wanted him fired is leading the most important operation of the war, while the aggressive American general who actually wins battles is stuck running a fictional headquarters, and the irony that this fictional headquarters contributes significantly to D-Day's success by deceiving German intelligence is completely lost on Patton, who sees only personal humiliation. Churchill's protection saved Patton's career, but couldn't save him from the political necessity of temporary exile, which suggests that even Churchill's support has limits when public pressure becomes too intense. And maybe Montgomery was partially right, that conduct issues eventually constrain even the most valuable commanders. Normandy after D-Day is where all these tensions explode, because Montgomery's plan calls for British and Canadian forces to hold German armor around Caen while American forces break out to the west, which is sound strategy, except it creates perception that British forces are stuck while American forces advance. And this perception infuriates Montgomery, who believes he's executing the plan exactly as designed while getting criticized for lack of progress. Patton arrives in Normandy in July commanding Third Army and immediately starts delivering the kind of rapid advance that Churchill predicted, breaking out from the Normandy bocage and racing across France faster than German forces can establish defensive lines. And every mile Patton advances feels to Montgomery like vindication of his critics, who claim American aggressive tactics work better than British methodical approaches. Except the military reality is that Patton's advances are possible because Montgomery is pinning German armor around Caen. The two approaches are complementary, not competitive, but neither general can admit that complementarity because their egos require proving their method is superior. Churchill watches this dynamic from London and probably feels vindicated that his decision to protect Patton is delivering exactly the kind of aggressive advance he wanted. But he also knows the command tensions are undermining operational coordination, and there's nothing he can do about it, because the Americans are now the dominant partner in the alliance, and British influence over American command decisions is declining proportionally with American force contributions. The race across France in August 1944 is Patton at his absolute best, and Montgomery at his most frustrated. Patton's Third Army is moving so fast that supply lines can't keep up, taking towns before German defenders realize they're coming, creating chaos in German rear areas that forces withdrawals across entire sectors. And this is exactly why Churchill protected Patton, because this kind of operational tempo cannot be taught or planned. It requires a commander with intuitive grasp of when to push beyond normal logistical constraints and when to exploit enemy confusion before they can recover. Montgomery is simultaneously executing Operations Goodwood and later Market Garden, trying to prove that British forces can deliver breakthrough victories, but his operations are constrained by his methodical approach that prioritizes force preservation over speed. And the contrast between Patton racing toward the German border and Montgomery carefully planning operations that partially fail reinforces every stereotype about aggressive Americans versus cautious British, which damages British prestige and Montgomery's personal reputation, while proving Churchill's judgment about the types of commanders modern warfare requires. Remember when Montgomery was confident Churchill would agree to remove Patton? Montgomery now watches Patton earn glory Montgomery desperately wants, and the psychological torture of seeing his enemy succeed while his own operations stall is probably worse punishment than any official reprimand Churchill could have delivered. Market Garden in September 1944 represents Montgomery's attempt to win the war with one bold stroke, and it fails catastrophically, which raises the question whether Montgomery learned the wrong lesson from Patton's success, whether he tried to imitate Patton's aggression without having Patton's intuitive understanding of when aggression works, whether the failure proves Montgomery's methodical approach is fundamentally his strength, and abandoning it for boldness plays against his nature. Churchill's response to Market Garden's failure is notably more forgiving than his response to Montgomery's attempt to remove Patton, which tells you everything about Churchill's actual priorities. He protects commanders who try aggressive operations even when they fail, because trying is strategically preferable to the cautious approach that Montgomery usually employs. And Market Garden's failure doesn't end Montgomery's career the way the slapping incidents almost ended Patton's, because by 1944, both commanders are too politically valuable to their respective nations to remove regardless of their failures or misconduct. This creates the worst possible command environment, where neither general faces real consequences for mistakes or misbehavior because political considerations override military accountability, and you could argue that Churchill's protection of Patton established this precedent where winning or trying to win excuses everything including assault and catastrophic operational failures. The final drive into Germany in 1945 brings Patton and Montgomery into direct operational competition again, because both want to be first to Berlin or first across the Rhine or first to claim some symbolic victory that defines the endgame. And Eisenhower is trying to manage these competing egos while actually winning the war, which means making decisions that inevitably favor one general over the other and provoke fury from whoever feels slighted. Patton's relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge is another moment of vindication for Churchill's judgment. Third Army pivots 90 degrees in terrible winter weather and breaks through to surrounded American forces in Bastogne with speed that military professionals consider nearly impossible. And this operation single-handedly justifies every controversial decision Churchill made to protect Patton, because if Third Army doesn't reach Bastogne when it does, the entire Battle of the Bulge potentially develops differently, with catastrophic implications for Allied strategy. Montgomery during the Bulge is commanding northern shoulder of the battle and doing competent professional work. But competent professional work doesn't generate headlines or glory, and the contrast between Patton's dramatic relief operation and Montgomery's solid defensive fighting again reinforces the narrative that aggressive American generals deliver victories while cautious British generals deliver adequate performance, which is unfair as military assessment, but accurate as public perception, and public perception matters in democracies at war because it influences political support for continued operations. The personality clash between Patton and Montgomery never resolves because neither man is capable of the kind of self-reflection that would allow acknowledging the other's strengths. Patton sees Montgomery as timid and glory-seeking and overly concerned with British prestige. Montgomery sees Patton as reckless and undisciplined and dangerously contemptuous of proper planning. And they're both partially right about each other, which makes reconciliation impossible, because accurate criticism is harder to dismiss than unfair criticism. Churchill understands both men better than they understand themselves. He knows Patton's aggression comes from deep insecurity about his military reputation and need to prove himself through constant action. He knows Montgomery's caution comes from genuine concern for soldiers' lives, combined with calculating careerism that prioritizes avoiding failure over achieving breakthrough success. And Churchill's genius is recognizing you need both types of commanders because different operational situations require different approaches. But his tragedy is being unable to make these two men cooperate effectively because ego conflicts override rational military calculation. The Allied victory in Europe happens despite this command dysfunction, not because of it, which raises uncomfortable questions about whether better command relationships could have shortened the war and saved lives, or whether the command tensions were an inevitable consequence of coalition warfare between nations with different military cultures and competing post-war interests. The post-war assessments of Churchill's decision to protect Patton divide along predictable lines. American historians generally praise it as recognizing military effectiveness over protocol. British historians often criticize it as political calculation that undermined military discipline, and the truth is probably that both interpretations are correct, depending on what you're measuring. If you're measuring contribution to Allied victory, then protecting Patton clearly was correct decision, because his operations contributed significantly to defeating Germany. But if you're measuring impact on military discipline and command culture, then protecting Patton clearly sent problematic message that effective commanders can assault subordinates without serious consequences, and Churchill made the calculation that winning the war mattered more than establishing precedents for peacetime military discipline. This is wartime leadership in its essence, making decisions that prioritize immediate victory over long-term institutional health, accepting that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary tolerance for behavior that peacetime would never accept, and trusting that post-war societies will sort out the institutional implications after survival is secured. And you can argue Churchill was right or wrong, but you cannot argue he was unclear about his priorities. Winning came first, and everything else, including military justice and command harmony, and personal reputations, came distant second. Patton's death in December 1945 from injuries in a car accident deprives history of seeing how his career would have developed in peacetime army, because there's legitimate question whether Patton's skills and temperament that made him effective in combat would have translated to peacetime military leadership, whether he could have adapted to institutional constraints and political realities, whether the army would have tolerated in peace what Churchill tolerated in war. Montgomery's post-war career as he rises to Chief of the Imperial General Staff and then Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO suggests he adapted successfully to peacetime military politics. But it also suggests his greatest skills were always institutional rather than operational. He was better at managing peacetime armies than fighting wartime battles, which means Churchill's assessment that Montgomery was valuable but not irreplaceable was probably correct, even though Churchill never could remove him for political reasons. The alternate history where Churchill agrees with Montgomery and removes Patton in 1943 is impossible to calculate with confidence. Maybe someone else delivers equivalent results. Maybe Third Army under different command doesn't relieve Bastogne in time. Maybe the war ends 6 months later with tens of thousands more casualties. Maybe everything happens roughly the same because individual commanders matter less than industrial capacity and troop numbers. But Churchill clearly believed that Patton was irreplaceable, and that belief drove his brutal response to Montgomery's suggestion, and the European war's outcome suggests Churchill's judgment was at minimum not wrong, even if we cannot prove it was uniquely right. The lesson here for understanding military leadership is that effectiveness and conduct are separate variables that leadership has to balance without perfect formulas for how to weight them. Sometimes conduct violations are serious enough that effectiveness doesn't matter, and commanders must be removed to preserve institutional integrity. Sometimes effectiveness is critical enough that conduct violations have to be tolerated to preserve operational capability. And the difficulty is determining which situations call for which priority. And Churchill's decision about Patton represents choosing effectiveness over conduct in moment of existential crisis, which is defensible in World War II, but creates dangerous precedent if applied to lesser conflicts where institutional health matters more than immediate tactical success. Modern militaries still struggle with this balance. They remove generals for relatively minor conduct issues while tolerating questionable tactical decisions, or they protect operationally successful commanders while ignoring conduct complaints. And there's no consistent framework that determines when effectiveness trumps conduct or vice versa, which means every case becomes political judgment call influenced by immediate circumstances and leadership priorities. Exactly like Churchill's decision was political judgment call influenced by his assessment that losing Patton weakened Allied capabilities more than tolerating his misconduct weakened military discipline. Montgomery spends his final decades believing history will vindicate his approach and criticize Patton's recklessness. He writes memoirs that emphasize careful planning and force preservation. He gives interviews stressing the importance of methodical operations, and he's generally dismissive of Patton's reputation while defending his own decisions, including Market Garden, which suggests he never understood why Churchill protected Patton or why aggressive commanders get historical recognition that methodical commanders often don't. Patton becomes legend precisely because his flaws were dramatic and his successes were visible, and his personality was larger than life, while Montgomery becomes respected professional whose competence is acknowledged, but whose caution makes him less interesting to popular memory. And this outcome would have driven Montgomery insane if he lived to see it fully develop, because Montgomery craved historical recognition more than almost anything else, and watching Patton become iconic while Montgomery becomes footnoted would have been psychological torture exceeding anything Churchill's 1943 response inflicted. The final irony of Churchill's brutal response to Montgomery's suggestion is that protecting Patton not only kept an effective general in command, but also condemned Montgomery to eternal second place in historical memory behind the man he tried to remove, which means Churchill's decision shaped not just World War II's outcome, but both men's historical legacies in ways nobody anticipated at the time. So here's what Churchill's brutal response really meant beyond the immediate question of Patton's command. It meant that in existential warfare, results matter more than process, that effective, difficult people are worth more than ineffective, pleasant people, that coalition leadership requires making decisions that protect alliance relationships even when they contradict your personal preferences, that military justice sometimes has to be subordinated to operational necessity, and that leaders who make these pragmatic calculations will be criticized by people who prioritize principle over outcomes, but vindicated by people who understand that losing wars renders all principles moot. Montgomery learned in that moment that his fame and reputation didn't give him influence over Allied strategic decisions, that Churchill valued victory over personal relationships, that American generals were going to be protected by American command and British complaints would be ignored when they conflicted with American preferences, and that his role in the alliance was to command his forces, effectively not to reshape Allied command structure according to his preferences. Churchill learned nothing from the episode because he already knew what he believed, that winning was the only thing that mattered, and anyone who didn't contribute to winning was expendable regardless of rank or reputation, and that philosophy carried Britain through 6 years of war, but left unresolved questions about where effectiveness ends and misconduct becomes intolerable. Questions that military organizations are still asking 80 years later when they face commanders who win battles but violate standards. And Churchill's response to Montgomery provides one answer to those questions, but not the only answer and maybe not even the right answer. Just an answer that worked in one specific moment when survival required tolerating imperfect people pursuing imperfect victory through imperfect means, because the alternative was defeat, and defeat was unacceptable. If this kind of honest examination of how command decisions actually get made interests you beyond the heroic narratives that dominate popular history, you know what to do. Subscribe for more stories about the messy reality of military leadership, where the right decision isn't always the moral decision, and the effective choice isn't always the principal choice, and the commanders who succeed aren't always the ones who deserve success. And tell me in comments which other command controversies you want examined, because World War II is full of moments where personality conflicts influenced strategic outcomes, and understanding those human dynamics explains more about how the war was won than studying battle tactics or industrial production, because wars are ultimately fought by human beings with human flaws, making human mistakes while trying to achieve inhuman objectives under impossible pressure. And those stories deserve telling, even when they don't fit comfortable narratives about heroes and villains and clear moral lessons.